Hey guys, last night I took what will very likely be the last trip to the old TV and radio repair shop. I brought my camera along to take some photos, but it was dark out and they didn't come out too well. But here's a couple to give you some idea of what we had to dig through. So, in all that soggy mess of cardboard, here is what I brought back this time. I think we did pretty good. I just brought this home. I got home like at midnight. I really have not looked through it thoroughly, but briefly, what I do know that I got for sure is some flybacks. Boxes are pretty soggy, but hopefully they're salvageable. Got some books. This one's all nice and wet, but this one was in a plastic bag, so it's in decent shape. Flybacks. A ton of power resistors. True Ohm, Mallory, Memcore. Some more CRTs, but they're all scope CRTs. Nothing for TVs. One gigantic 1,000-watt light bulb. A couple of what appear to be phonograph lids that were just flipped over and filled with tubes. I don't know what's in there. I just grabbed them all. Found some more Svetlana 6550 audio output tubes, and so on. So I'll bring this stuff inside, start sorting through it, and let's see what I found. I've started bringing in all that stuff, and the first thing I'm going to do is clean off the larger glass items because they're quite dirty. Before I do any cleaning, I always make note of what the number is or any designators on the tube in case they get removed in the cleaning process. This old printing on these tubes can sometimes come off quite easily just with water even. But I do actually use, for the most part, just general purpose blue, I guess it's ammonia-based glass cleaner. I do avoid spraying directly onto the numbers though, or wiping directly on the numbers. Just kind of work my way around it. I use a nice soft microfiber cloth, and that generally does a pretty good job. Sometimes things can be a bit more stubborn, like this residue from a sticker, it seems like, and for that I will use acetone. Kind of nasty stuff. It's got some fumes. You don't want to have prolonged contact with skin, but this removes every type of gooey adhesive I've come across, and it leaves a pretty clean surface after the fact. So let's see what I can see how these clean up. One of the things I really like about tubes is how nicely they clean up, even just if you're going to put them on display. And see, it cleans up pretty easily. Sometimes it helps to let it soak in for a few seconds, especially on these really filthy tubes that have been lying around for years. Now, sometimes on CRTs, they can have what's called a burn-in, especially in scope CRTs. That'll happen if the scope is used a lot and there's a horizontal trace, it'll burn a line into the phosphor. Or if somebody leaves it focused on a sharp point like an XY mode, it can burn a hole right through the phosphor. This one looks pretty good though. Let's see on these others. Well, it looks pretty good too. So this is it's a Sylvania. I think it's a 5CP1. Yeah, that's what it looks like. This is a Dumont 3ACP11, I think. So there's a case where the numbers have started to wear off. It's got a 3AC, and I'm guessing that that's a P1. Luckily, it's also printed on the base, and it is indeed a 3ACP1A. That's a 5 FP7. That's a radar tube. The P in the number afterwards is the phosphor type. P1 is the traditional green medium persistence scope phosphor. P7 is a mix of short persistence, I think like a blue-white phosphor, and a long persistence yellow phosphor. That's what they use in old radar CRTs, where there's like a hand that sweeps around and you see little blips that slowly fade away. And this guy is... I don't know what this is. I'll have to hunt around for the label on it, if there is one. Oh, I see, it's a Toshiba. Well, this is Japanese, so it's a whole different story there. They used a different designating system. So this must have been for probably a Japanese scope. So I'll have to look that number up online to figure out what kind of CRT this is. I've pretty much finished cleaning up this CRT, and still haven't been able to quite make out that designator. But as you can see, when I cleaned it, it did not remove any of it. So another trick that I've found is to use a super bright LED little flashlight like this. If you go at different angles, you can really highlight those old labels. And now I can see that this is actually a 3GP1, not a 3CP1. And I think that's a Canadian maple leaf up top, so maybe this tube was made in Canada. Even if this printing was completely worn off, often by kind of breathing on it to make a little fog on it and shining a light at all different angles, you can actually pick out those old markings on there. So yeah, all cleaned up quite nicely. I guess with the exception of the metal base in the Sylvania, I'm not quite sure what to do about that. If I try to polish it, I'll remove all the remaining marks, Sylvania and their green leaf logo and so on, so I think I'll just leave that alone. Similarly with regular tubes, I've got some rust issues on some of these, like these metal tubes. Yeah, I suppose I could use rust remover and repaint them and whatnot, but for the most part these are all fairly common tubes, so I don't think I'll be going to any great lengths to do that. Some of them are pretty bad too. But otherwise I just use the same general techniques. Like here's one that's pretty filthy, so you can see it's a 6W4, so make note of that. And I'll spray it, and because this is so dirty and it's caked on, I'm going to let that sit for a few moments. I'll carefully wipe it off. The glass cleaner did a pretty good job on this tube, and as you can see, it did not wipe off the number at all. 6W4GT, still very legible. But there is some kind of crud on the side here that just wasn't coming off, so I'm going to try a little acetone on that. Acetone, if you're not familiar with it, is marketed generally as nail polish remover. At least in drugstores it is. It's also used in a number of industrial applications. And it's a pretty good solvent. So a little bit of wiping has already got most of that crud off, just a little bit more around the base. Speaking of bases, some of these tube pins are kind of corroded. What I've been doing so far is I clean up the glass to the point where I can see what the tube designator is, and I clean up the pins if they're really filthy. Then I test the tube, because there's no point in me going way out to clean a tube if it's actually bad. Once I know it's good, I'll clean up the rest of the glass. And if it's a really valuable tube, I will make some effort, like with Simichrome metal polish, to get some of this oxidation and crud off of it. Also a good idea if you're going to be testing a lot of dirty tubes like this is to get a socket saver for your tube tester. That's basically like another octal socket that piggybacks into the octal socket on your tube tester. Otherwise, when you're testing hundreds of tubes with filthy pins, you're going to be building up a lot of crud in your tube test, and you could very well wear out that socket, and they're not so easy to replace. I checked the tube and it did test good, so I went ahead and finished cleaning it. You may see a few flecks there on the glass. Those are actually on the inside. Little bits of tube element that I guess have broken off, but I don't think will affect normal operation. Now, last thing you may encounter on a tube is a loose base, like this one. Did a whole video on replacing and re-gluing tube bases, but briefly, what I use is this Permatex windshield and glass sealer. I unscrew the cap and dip a toothpick in there, just get a little bit on there and work it into that seam between the base and the glass and let it set up, and it works really, really well. It withstands high heat, no problem. Don't use super glue because that will not hold up to the heat. It'll turn white and it will lose its bond, and you'll be back to a loose base in no time. Once I've identified, cleaned, and tested a tube, it's time to store it in something. Ideally, I've still got the original box to put it back in, but for the vast majority of these tubes, I have no boxes, so I ended up buying some of these on eBay and some from Antique Electronics Supply. They can get a little bit expensive, sure, but it's much easier to find them when they're stored and labeled, and categorized, and it protects the tubes, so I think it's worth the investment. Some of you may be wondering what's the deal with these metal tubes. Most tubes are glass, why are these metal? Well, it was an invention, I think, by RCA in the mid-30s. It was a way to make tubes a bit smaller, more rugged, and this provides excellent shielding to the tube elements inside. You may have seen radios that have metal shields that slide over the glass tube. Well, these have a built-in shield that really encases the whole tube. There are also glass versions of some of these metal tubes. For example, these are both 6SJ7s. But if you look close, this says 6SJ7 GT. I think the GT stands for glass type. These are not necessarily interchangeable. You have to check on your radio, because I believe that this metal shield is connected to one of these pins, or maybe more than one of these pins. And that could be a problem if your radio is expecting a glass type and they were using one of these pins maybe for, maybe it was an unused pin and they would just use it for a tie point for other components. And if that's actually going to the shield, that could be bad. For example, Philco radios of the 30s did not use metal tubes. That was an RCA thing. They used tubes made by Sylvania, I believe, and they were the glass type. So, something to be aware of. Now these tubes with their odd looking metal bases are called Loktal, L-O-K-T-A-L. I believe they were invented by Philco in the 40s for use in car radios. There's a metal ring here on the center post, and that would snap into the socket and hold them in place so the engine vibrations wouldn't work them loose. You have to be especially careful when you clean these because this printing comes off very easily. I wouldn't be surprised if they use the same ink as they used on their dial scales and their radios, where it was a water-based ink and it comes right off. So, for example, this one's very dirty. I'm going to have to very carefully clean that, maybe with some alcohol, so I can read that number and test them properly. Alright, I've pretty much finished sorting through all the tubes in this latest batch and done a first pass on cleaning them, and I thought I'd point out some of the more interesting stuff that I found. First up, in all these little boxes are what's called acorn tubes. I think these were invented in the late 30s, and these were, at the time, very high frequency tubes. I think these could do maybe up to a couple hundred megahertz. And they achieved that by using this unique packaging style. Here's what a socket would look like for one of these. And I think you can see why they call them acorn tubes. Within a few years, though, tubes like the 6J6 performed far better and were a normal style like this. So these weren't around for too long, and they really aren't too useful for anything other than restoring vintage test equipment and probably some radio equipment from early in the war. And then there's all these tubes. Some of these are foreign tubes, audio output tubes. It's a nice 5R4 full wave rectifier. Here's some more of the Yugoslavian tubes. I got one of these last time. It's an EL34 type, I believe. And here's another KT90. I did test the other KT90 following a suggestion I got that it's similar to a KT88 and a 6550. And I tested it in my tester using a 6550 settings, and it did test pretty good. Here's a Sovtek. Let's see. EL34G. Here's another Svetlana 6550C. And here are a couple tubes that just say Ruby on them and no other marking. But based on all the other tubes, they seem to all basically be 6550s, or very similar. So I would guess that these are also in that family. Yeah, there's another Svetlana 6550. Now this guy, oh, I'm sorry, not that guy. This guy. There's a very interesting name on the base here. DeForest, who you may have heard of, sometimes credited as inventing the vacuum tube. He goes way back into the teens and 20s. DeForest Sanabria. Well, Sanabria was a Cuban immigrant, and between the two of them, they came out with a brand name, DeForest Sanabria, and I know they made TVs, they may have made radios and other things. DeForest was fairly elderly by then, and I think Sanabria just did a deal with him so they could join the names together to have a little more cachet, I guess. DeForest Sanabria TVs are really rare. I think there's less than a dozen known to exist. I had the opportunity to actually get one last summer, but the set was just huge. It was a 27-inch black and white set, and it was just monstrous. So not only would it not fit into my car, but even if I could get it here, I don't even know if it would have fit through one of my doors, because my place was built in the 1870s, and it has fairly small dimensions in all the doors. But even if I got it into my place, I wouldn't have anywhere to put it. But if you ever come across DeForest Sanabria, it's an interesting little bit of history. It's one of the least known brands out there. This is another World War II era tube. They call these button tubes or something like that, where it's just a... And again, it's an early type of high frequency tube where they made an odd little package to fit it into. And I did find a 1i tube. I have not found the designator on it. I love the quality control on some of the stuff back then. It's at a nice, like, 15-degree angle from the base to the glass envelope. A Webcore brand, which is kind of odd. Webcore is known for making tape recorders and such, so maybe this came out of a tape recorder or a wire recorder. I don't know. Hopefully I'll use all my tricks and find the designator on it. Here we've got some of the more earlier types, the shoulder types, where it has that distinct glass envelope on it. It's an 83V. I'm familiar with type 83s, which are full wave mercury rectifiers. I think an 83V has similar characteristics but no mercury. I'll have to do a little research on that. Here's a type 80. Always nice to have. A lot of early radios use these. Now this. Here's an example of some really crappy printing job they did on the glass. This just got a little bit of moisture on it, and these just slid right off like a water slide decal. Luckily, I was able to read it before it got obliterated, and this is a 2A3. Made in China, unfortunately. 2A3s go for a pretty good penny amongst the audiophile crowd. Made in China, probably not so much, but it's actually the first 2A3 I've ever seen it in the flesh, so regardless of where it was made, it's kind of neat to have. Don't have any radios that need one, but hopefully it tests good and maybe somebody out there can use it. And lastly, 5X4. I'm not familiar with this. It looks a lot like a Type 80 or a 5U4, so I assume it has similar characteristics. I'll have to do a little research on that as well. Now, there's one last tube I wanted to show you guys, but it's in my office. I'm glad my friend Dave went along with me on some of my expeditions, because even though he's not really into vintage electronics, he seems to have a knack for spotting stuff that I missed, and this is one of them. What this is a tube made in the 20s by a company called Arcturus, famous for using blue glass to make their tubes. The base is missing, but I hope to be able to replace it. The vacuum seems to be intact, and I think all the leads are there. But there's not a single mark on this glass envelope anywhere. I know it's Arcturus because it's blue glass, but beyond that, how the heck can you figure out what kind of tube you've got? Well, luckily, because this company is so famous, there's a whole website dedicated to them, and they have thumbnails of every tube that they ever made. And by scrolling through this list and comparing the elements to what I've got, and the number of pins and so on, I can pretty confidently say that it is an Arcturus 27. So if you compare that to this, I think you can see that they look identical. Now, if it's not something as well known as Arcturus, if you go to the Antique Radio Forum and go into the area of the forum dedicated to tubes and parts, and you ask, just post a picture of your tube and ask, what is this? I can almost guarantee somebody will know what your tube is. I'll pull up some examples and show you what I mean. So here's an example of a tube that I couldn't identify, this one down here. It looked vaguely European to me, but there weren't any marks on it that I recognized, so I took a picture and posted it on here and asked for help. And right away I got a response. Looks like a 6L6. And further down, got a definitive answer. It's a Mullard EL37. And further down I mentioned that there are some faint marks I could find, R61 B8H. And this guy tells me exactly what that means. What version it is. It was made in the Mullard Blackburn factory in 1958 in August. So how cool is that? So if you ever can identify a tube, post as much info as you can at the Antique Radio Forum. I'm sure somebody can identify it for you. Alright, that is it for me talking about the tubes, but I'm going to do a third part and I'm going to talk about all the other non-tube stuff that I picked up.